we already have no excuse absentee voting in every way, shape, and form. And I would defy anyone to tell me that we don't, or that somehow someone was precluded from being able to vote by absentee ballot in the last several general elections, because they were. The fact of the matter is that COVID kind of changed the world, and the Secretary of State at the time took it upon herself to effectively make everyone eligible to vote by by absentee ballot by playing fast and loose with the definition of illness. And ultimately, that allowed everyone to participate via a mail-in absentee ballot. And we could certainly discuss whether that was a good or bad policy given the circumstances of the pandemic. And I think that's why it happened with very little opposition. The problem is that after the pandemic subsided, the process continued. And effectively over the last couple of years, I believe that this General Assembly has gone well beyond the realm of the Constitution. Last year passing a bill effectively statutizing, if that's a word, the Constitution by redefining the word illness in statute, allegedly to say that that's what the Constitution always said, which makes absolutely no sense to anyone who is using the tiniest bit of reason, because effectively suggesting that anyone would be eligible based on illness without defining that it's their specific illness, or even defining it more broadly to include a relative or someone they care for or some reason that's relevant to that person, just by saying the word illness, you have effectively included everyone, because illness has existed in the past, will exist in the future, and is prevalent in every day of every week of everyone's life in some way, whether it connects to them personally or not. And I bring this up because I just find it completely ironic that we're here to discuss continuing down this road of a constitutional amendment for something we already have, that's been established both by the precedent of the Secretary of State, a challenge made to the Supreme Court of the state of Connecticut, where the Supreme Court effectively said that illness means any illness, anytime, anywhere, since the dawn of humankind, all the way up to the... It's all good. I am often accused of liking to hear the sound of my own voice. So.
Sounds great.
I assure you that's not the purpose today, Mr. Chairman, but thank you. So, where was I? I was going on and on about no excuse absentee voting and how we already have it. And it really, at the end of the day, I mean, that's my issue. You know, we were talking in caucus before this meeting about, you know, the relevance of all the policy that's on today's agenda. And I would just say in more global terms, directly related to the notion of no excuse absentee voting, but, you know, talking about voting in general, which is that the majority is clearly laser focused on expanding access to voting. And I'm extremely sympathetic to that. Every one of us on this committee, I think, came to be on this committee because we value our electoral system in this country, and we want to make sure that people are actively participating in our political system. And, you know, there's no greater way for individuals to benefit than to be part of who they're choosing, who their representatives are. So we are all very much in favor of access. And I can tell you that the great frustration that those of us on the minority side have is that every time we try and engage in a discussion about the best way to move forward on access, must contain elements of protecting the integrity and sanctity of the vote. And, you know, sometimes we're pegged as being, you know, against access or trying to suppress the vote and things like that. That's all nonsense. And I think anyone who took the time, even a few minutes, to watch one of our hearings and our discussions would realize that we're here for a very important purpose, which is that, you know, expanding access to elections is great, up until the point where people don't trust those elections anymore. And I'm afraid that that's where we are in this country. There is a great many people. I think when I was a kid, I would go back and say, when I was a kid, I don't think anyone that I knew would ever even mention or say or come up with the idea that we have flaws in our election process that are worth discussing. I think people understood that America being America had elections that were well run, reliable, and that could be trusted beyond any doubt. That's not true anymore. You know, the last two presidents of the United States and their supporters both have claimed that there were problems in the election. Both losing candidates in both of the most recent presidential elections claimed that there were problems in the elections. People on the street see that there are problems. Now, that's not to say that the allegations made by any of these parties are 100% valid. In fact, I'd say the majority of them are not. I would say that they are greatly exaggerated. But to say that there's no such thing as voter fraud or that there are no problems is also absolutely false. The fact of the matter is that there are problems. And I think those problems stem from pushing our access to voting faster than we can make a process that can be relied on. Connecticut, I think, probably does a better job than a lot of other states in how our elections are run, and I think that's a credit to the people involved. The fact of the matter is that I think we have an excellent workforce on the local municipal level, and I think the fact that we do elections on a town level is also helpful in that regard. And generally speaking, people are dealing with many people that they know personally, and the folks that are running the election are accountable on a personal level. I think that all matters. But we also are missing so many things. Recently, we had a visit from the Secretary of State of Georgia, and just talking with him, we learned so much about what we don't have in Connecticut. Certain things we knew, you know, photo ID. They have photo ID for in-person voting in Georgia. They have photo ID for absentee voting in Georgia. They have photo ID for every type of vote. And from what I could tell, that was also a bipartisan decision there. They also have a verification process that they use on absentee voting, which certainly makes an example of Connecticut and our failure to have any such process. We have no signature verification. We have no effective means of determining whether or not the right person actually completed that ballot application. And that's a concern. We should have a mechanism that makes it very, very hard to go around our system, and more importantly, so that people can regain their trust in our election process. I've said during several of the debates that we've had in this committee on some of the election bills that they should be bipartisan votes. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to get together and discuss the rules of the game, which effectively that's what voting is. I mean, that's not a policy that should be debated like, you know, gun control or abortion or something like that, where there's, you know, extreme ideological differences. This is just agreeing to the fact that our baseball games can have 9 innings and 3 outs and that sort of thing. We should be able to have that conversation, and it should be done on a bipartisan basis. And I'm saddened that, you know, almost every time we have a debate on one of these really substantive issues like early voting or no excuse absentee voting, that it always ends up on a party line. And for legitimate reasons. And maybe they are ideologically based. But I don't see that we could be so far off on agreeing to the rules of the game that we couldn't really be an example to the rest of this legislature and to politics in general, that we could actually listen to one another enough to come up with something that everybody agrees with. I'll say a final word about the no excuse absentee voting, because I know that I'm supposed to be talking about these resolutions specifically. And we're certainly going to talk more about early voting when that comes up on our agenda. But my number one issue with this right now, the no excuse absentee voting, is not the no excuse absentee voting at all. It is, in fact, the process by which it's been done. I think, the process that got us to the point where we have no excuse absentee voting without a constitutional amendment today is problematic, and effectively trying to go back and pass a constitutional amendment for no excuse absentee voting after the fact, I don't know what the purpose of that is. And I also wonder what people will say if it ultimately goes to the people of Connecticut, as it has before, and fails, knowing that we are actually living under no excuse absentee voting without this constitutional amendment today. And I'll say one more thing, which is that if I have one complaint about this, it's not that I'm trying to prevent anyone from being able to vote by absentee for no reason, because I am totally fine with that. The problem comes from the fact of where their ballot applications come from. The fact of the matter is that once you establish a system that does not require a specific excuse for a specific voter, now everyone becomes eligible, and now anyone can start providing ballot applications. And we've witnessed this, and I warned against it several times in previous debates on this subject, that what will happen is exactly what has happened, and we saw it in the most recent election, which is that first, we had the issue where the state sent out ballot applications to everyone based on our voter rolls, which is another topic that we could get into, but we'll leave that for now. Or in the following municipal election, I think many municipalities actually sent out the ballot applications. And those two things are bad enough because of the failure of the list to be accurate enough to make sure that everyone was treated equally and that everyone who was supposed to get one did, and that ballot applications were not sent erroneously to people that should not have them. That's number one. But what happened in 2022 is far, far worse. And that is the states and the towns did not send them, so various political operators did. Republican candidates for elected office put together a list of people that they thought were inclined to support them, and they sent ballot applications to just those people. Democratic candidates did the same thing. They looked at the list. They said, these people are most likely to support me. I'm going to send ballot applications to them. When that happens, and you start to have politically based operations determining who has more or less access than other people, you have failed at your responsibility of making sure that you have open and fair elections, in my opinion. So because we can't amend this resolution, I'm going to find another place, another way, another time to do it. But it would be my goal that we establish a system where the only person that can request an absentee ballot, even without a reason, assuming no excuse absentee voting becomes the law of the land, is that voter themselves. If you have enough initiative to request the ballot, then you can vote by absentee. But this idea of candidates and political operations, especially ones that are more well-funded than others, having more ability to drive and get out their vote than others, to me is unfair, and I think it's a practice that we shouldn't get into. I'm not going to support this amendment here today, Mr. Chairman, simply because I don't believe it's necessary. I think we are already operating under this system. And if I had some sort of assurance that if we passed no excuse absentee voting as a constitutional amendment and the voters supported it, that we could clean up this process so that, A, we have clean up, we have legitimate voter rolls that everyone could rely on with their accuracy. And number two, we were prohibiting political actors from engaging in the process, including mailing out applications, and leaving it simply to expanding access to voters who will take the initiative on their own to request an absentee ballot. And those are my remarks on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll just briefly piggyback on my colleague, Representative Mastro Francesco's comments. I guess I don't know that this would be a bad policy. I mean, it's very similar to the policy that we have currently. Please correct me, anyone, if I'm wrong about this, but I think that you can pre-register right now if you're 17 years old. So And that is allowed because our Constitution does stipulate that ability to occur. And I guess just on top of the things that Representative Mastro Francesco mentioned, my number one issue with this is that it's a constitutional amendment. I have this belief that the Constitution of our state and our country certainly has a mechanism to be changed, but it shouldn't be changed for light or transient causes, I think is the most apropos language. And I just see this as completely unnecessary based on so many other factors. I mean, the fact is you can do it when you're 17. We also have Election Day registration in Connecticut. And in fact, the early voting bills that are before us, all of them contain the provision that Election Day registration will exist throughout the period of early voting, whatever that is. So you're going to have plenty of opportunity and ample options for someone looking to register to vote. Even if they show up to vote on the same day, they can register in Connecticut. I just think this is a bill in search of something it doesn't need to be searched for at this point, based on the other things we have. And again, if it was just a bill change that we could do because it was allowed in our Constitution, I might support it because I don't see any reason not to. I don't want the citizens of Connecticut to feel like they've got to, weigh in on a change to our Constitution at the ballot box every time they go. The Constitution is supposed to be kind of our rock that we lean on because it is the basic structure of our government. And I'm not against changing it. I'm just against changing it willy-nilly every year. And it seems to me we've had a tremendous number of constitutional amendments that have not just been proposed, because there's dozens of proposals every year. I'm probably guilty of some of them. But the fact of the matter is we're just doing too many. And we should leave our constitutional changes for things of real substance unless there is a genuine need. And I just don't see a genuine need in this particular case. So I'll be voting no. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me state for the record that Connecticut does have the best pizza in the world, whether this bill passes or not. And I think that is to my colleague's point, which is that I don't think the legislature needs to comment on whether or not Connecticut has the best pizza in the world. I think we know that whether the legislature says so or not. In fact, in many ways, I think that the legislature voting to make it so diminishes that fact. And I'm going to be a no today also, and mainly because of several things that have happened to me over my tenure here at the Capitol. I remember one time being in the House chamber at about 4:30 in the morning after we had debated a number of items, and I think we were waiting on some monumental, important bill. And, of course, it wasn't ready yet, or the majority was, trying to get their members in line, or who the heck knows what was happening, but we were voting on random items, and I remember voting on the state medal being titanium at like 4:30 in the morning. And I remember being pretty aggravated by that subject matter. And since then, I've had quite a few constituents come up to me over the years and say to me, I saw in the news you guys were voting on the state dog or state, bird or whatever. It's like, don't you have better things to do? And I completely, understand and convey to them, that obviously we do a lot of things. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And even though there are a lot of important issues, we do have time to do some other maybe less important items as well. But the sentiment is there, and I think it shouldn't escape any of us that we're here to do serious business. We're going to discuss a major change in Connecticut law. For the first time since Connecticut began, Election Day is going to expand potentially beyond Election Day. That's a pretty consequential and pretty heavy measure that should be taken absolutely seriously, and I think it's maybe the most serious thing we'll do in this legislative body this year. It may be the most serious thing that I have a opportunity to participate in my whole, time in politics. And to have, pizza as the state food on the same agenda is a little ironic in my opinion. So I'll be voting no. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the chairs for bringing this bill forward. I think overall, I think this is excellent policy changes that will certainly help. I have, witnessed, been a part of a few different recount situations, including my own. The first time I was elected, I was involved in a statutory recount myself. And I was certainly watching and observing at a recount that happened in the town of Southington most recently. And I think, in particular, the final section of the bill encapsulates something that I think is very, very important, which is that there was a disagreement among some individuals, not in Southington, but I heard this happen in other places, over what the definition of observe really means. Some registrar might believe that allows folks to come up close and personal and watch the ballots going into the machine, and other ones felt that you could observe, but across the room, please, where you can't really tell what's going on. And I think it's very important that we clarified that situation, and it will, assuming this bill does become law, it does read, any party representative present shall have a right to view each ballot as it is being recanvassed by the recanvass officials, so as to be able to discern the markings on such ballot. And I think that's a crucial and important key part of doing an appropriate and proper recount. And I'm glad that we've made that clarification in the law. The rest of the items, I don't know that some of our election officials will be pleased that there is a mandate in here to require them to watch an instructional training video. But my understanding is this is a short 8-minute video that they will watch along with their staff prior to the recount. I don't know that it's too much to ask necessarily. So I'm going to support this today and look forward to seeing how this progresses on the floor. And thank you very much again, Mr. Chairman. That's an important key thing that I wanted to see happen.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so I'm very close to supporting the legislation that's before us. I know that there were some concerns about this bill when it came before the General Assembly in a previous year. It may have been last year. I know it went to the Judiciary Committee. And I know that over there, the concern was really the breadth and width of the Attorney General's authority. And the one thing that I think raised the most concern is that the potential was there for him to start to investigate information relative to the payment of taxes to the state. And I noticed that section was removed, or it's not removed, but there's a statement made in lines 102 to 104 saying that the provisions of this section shall not apply to any claim, record, or statement made or presented relative to the payment of taxes to the state. So I think that's a good thing, and I think it gets it a whole lot closer to being in a place where I could support it. I remember the conversation I had with the Attorney General here during our public hearing, and he made a very compelling argument about how this authority should expand beyond the realm that is in the current statute, which is the healthcare field itself. And I don't disagree. And in fact, I'm someone who is kind of a hawk as far as the taxpayers' money, and I want to make sure that the state is not paying out more than it should. And if there are bad actors out there that are engaged in defrauding the state for money, they ought to be prosecuted. And I don't know that we have a prudent method currently. It's something that I need to learn more about, too, to find out exactly what happens in the case of a contractor dealing with the state. And there is some issue of a claim made that, work was completed that wasn't actually completed or something like that. What exactly happens? How's that process go forward? I guess the only reservation that I have about this bill still is in the underlying law, which effectively says that the penalties are substantial. And I don't know that if someone didn't purposely draft the original law to say that if you're in a state administered health or human services program, that you should face really severe penalties. It looks like treble damages and some other types of things are included in the penalty provisions at the end of the bill, subsection B, it looks like, of Section 2. So I don't know. I mean, to me, that's the number one thing. It's like I do want to make sure that we have the ability to investigate and prosecute wrongdoers. Although I don't know, without being a little more certain, that this is the appropriate method to get there. Giving the authority to the Attorney General is one thing, but giving the authority to the Attorney General to levy such very, very significant fines and penalties does concern me a little bit. So hopefully we can have a conversation about this going forward. I will vote for it today in the interest of making it clear that I don't disagree with the notion of the policy idea, but I think it needs to be done fairly. I know that the vast majority of the testimony that we saw was coming from people that are doing contract work with the state, and I get that. And I'm certainly sympathetic to them, and I want them to know that as well, that I'm not in favor of seeing them punished for things that they didn't knowingly or willingly engage in that are unlawful. But anyway, those are my comments today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Is there further comments? Seeing none.
And I appreciate you referencing the other bills on the agenda simultaneously. My intent today is to confine my comments really to the bill that's before us, but I hope you'll just grant me the latitude to refer to the other bills occasionally, since, as you mentioned, they are very, very similar except for the time frames and the inclusion of referendum votes included in the other two bills. It'll just simplify our conversation, I think, if we can kind of talk about all three of them at the same time, but really focus on 1057 when it comes to the language in the bill and the line numbers, as you had mentioned. As was mentioned early on in the meeting today, we got the final language of these bills just this morning, so we had a limited amount of time to really delve in. And I've been kind of going back and forth in my head about how I want to approach this conversation today to talk more about the policy and the implementation versus the language of the bill. I'll just go back to some of my earlier comments about the no excuse absentee voting to suggest that everyone here on the committee is concerned with making sure that the system of voting in Connecticut is as open and unrestricted as it can possibly be, so that we can accommodate our fellow citizens in their ability to be able to participate in representative government, which is something that is extremely near and dear to me. And in fact, I love this country so much based on the concept of the way we govern ourselves, the value of which I'm afraid every day is being lost, because people, I don't know that they consider it as precious as they should, the fact that we live in a truly free country where the people themselves determine what the laws are via the representatives that they elect to serve them. And it is so critically important that that process, the process of elections, is completely confidence-worthy, I guess is the word I'm searching for, and that the people trust the outcome, and that it's beyond reproach. And that's been my function in this committee since the first day that I sat here as a member of the GAE committee, which is to say, I'm all for creating laws that are going to expand the ability for people to vote, but we've got to make sure that we keep that trust at the highest level attainable. And so that's what I'm here for today as well. And my comments about this bill are simply in an effort to make this process better and to make sure that if we're going to have this, we're going to do it in a way that I think honors our system and our recognition that our constituents are our bosses. So I want to just go back to the start of the early voting process. I think most of the public has a pretty basic understanding of what has transpired, which is that in order to change our law in Connecticut, we needed to change the Constitution, and that's been achieved. And the process I outlined earlier, talking about the no excuse absentee voting constitutional amendment, is the same. And the early voting constitutional amendment had to pass this legislature one time because it had passed the previous legislature one time as well. And it met that requirement for it to go on to a ballot and ultimately was put before the people to make a decision. One of the things that I've had a problem with ever since the start of our debate and discussion on early voting is the failure of the constitutional amendment and the question that was ultimately put to the voters to specify any detail whatsoever, including the time frame of early voting. And I think that that remains the number one sticking point on this legislation. Many people, not just me, because I would fall into this category, but I think many people remember voting the first time when they were 18 or thereabouts in life and recognize our election process as a snapshot in time and something that we gather once every year or every 2 years in the case of different types of elections to cast our vote for our representatives. And the advent of early voting and broad expansions of absentee voting, I think, have kind of changed our vision about what voting is in some ways. But I'll just remind people that, you know, there is a downside to having a long period of early voting, and that is that an election really is a point in time. Things can change. You may have a different opinion about a particular candidate or candidates on one day than you might have on another day, based on things you find out about that candidate, things you find out about their opponent or opponents, things you find out about yourself, and also things going on in the world. You know, you might be choosing one particular candidate because of a position on some issue that might be near and dear to you, and who knows? Something might happen to change what is important to you radically. I don't know if I can come up with an example, but you know, maybe there's one candidate you would feel much more confident from a standpoint of our national security, and God forbid a threat from, you know, China or Russia or something like that was to occur. You would feel much more confident about one candidate over the other, but you might also think that you prefer the other candidate for other issues. Maybe it's taxes or social issues or something like that. Well, suppose you vote for the candidate who's good on the social issues on the first day of early voting, and then ultimately we go to war days later. I think that giving too long a period can really upset the balance of making good decisions on who we're casting our votes for. Not to mention the fact that, you know, our process of elections happens on a timeline. Every person sitting at this dais has been a candidate for office, and they have put together a campaign to run for office and a schedule to do so. You know, starting with, you know, announcing their candidacy and raising money, and then figuring out they're going to spend that money and what methods they're going to use to reach voters and put out information about their positions. And obviously those things are all related directly to election day, because you need to get all of your resources to culminate on that day. And that, I'm talking about this from a candidate standpoint, but this also matters to the constituents that are going to cast their votes, because clearly the candidates have to make their best effort to get this information in front of voters before they cast their vote. But when you start to extend the period of voting, you may be upsetting the ability of those constituents to get all of the necessary information, or preventing candidates from being able to get what's important that they feel that they need to put in front of the voters out in time. And everything else that's connected with that, you know, has the same concerns and issues. The press being able to communicate issues to potential voters, et cetera, et cetera. So just something to think about. there's a lot of data out there also about states that have explored early voting, and I think the number one focus that people that advocate for early voting often is we want early voting because we want to make sure that we're creating convenience for people. And I'm certainly sympathetic to that. I mean, we want to make sure that it's convenient for people to vote. And obviously, it can be difficult in certain circumstances, based on someone's work schedule or traveling or who knows. And we should try and come up with policies that accommodate that to the degree that is feasible while maintaining the integrity of an election. That's where I would come from on that from a basic position. And that's where we should work to. But states that have gone with very long periods of early voting, many of them have actually shortened the time frame. And they've also recognized that there was not a significant increase in turnout. In fact, in some states where early voting has been rolled out, the actual turnout figure has dropped. So I don't know if we're achieving our goal by doing a broad expansion. As was mentioned, the bill that's before us comes to us from the Secretary of State, her recommendation being 10 days total of early voting, inside, I think, 11 days. And the other bills are for 14 days of early voting. And, we had one of those at the hearing, I think, was even as much as 18 days. My position, since we started this debate, was, look, I'm in the minority. I don't have a lot to say. If you guys want early voting, we're going to have early voting. Can I please be part of the conversation? Can we please try and do something that's reasonable, especially considering that it's now a constitutional amendment, and it is within the power and the hands of the majority party in the legislature to change this policy as they see fit. So there's no requirement that we go all at once, as fast as we can in a big rush. I would advocate for starting small and saying, look, we don't need 14 days of early voting to start with. We don't need 10 days of early voting to start with. The amendment that has been offered by myself and some of my Republican colleagues year after year when discussing the constitutional amendment was to limit it to 3 days within 5 days. So that would give you the opportunity to capture maybe a Friday, Monday, Tuesday, or a Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, something like that. And I feel like that might be a way to start rather than to go whole hog into a long period. Because you have to remember, there's a lot more to this than simply suggesting that we need to give more time for people to vote. That has to happen on the ground. The towns run our election process, and they're going to be the ones faced with figuring out the logistics of making this happen. The state certainly is going to have some additional costs, which will be borne by taxpayers. But the towns really are where the action's going to happen. And, they've got to not only staff a polling location or more than one for this time frame. They will need additional poll workers. They will need people who are involved in the counting of ballots. And the entire process has to be worked out on their level on exactly how it's going to work and be coordinated over whatever period of time ultimately we choose for early voting. And I can't stress enough that I think we're asking a lot of these town officials, even to expand it by 1 day, and to do it by multiple days and as much as 2 weeks, I think is really a lot to put on them in a short period of time. I know just talking to people in town government in my district that they have trouble filling all of the slots for poll workers on one election day. I don't know how we're going to manage if it ends up being for a considerable town period longer than that. I will say that early voting is attractive to me especially in Connecticut in the current environment as a alternative, although it will be used in conjunction with no excuse absentee voting, which, as I mentioned earlier, I believe we already have, irregardless of whether or not the constitutional amendment passes. And the reason for that is that I think early voting simply requires someone to visit a polling location in person and present themselves. It's widely understood. In fact, anytime we've had debates on this subject matter, people know that I like to quote Senator Martin Looney because he mentioned during one of our debates several years ago that no one ever can be sure who actually filled out an absentee ballot. That was his comment, not mine. I'm certainly not saying I'm quoting him 100% directly. I don't have it in front of me, but that's the gist of what he said. And it's because everybody knows that. Everybody knows that if there is the potential for problems in elections, it's going to happen in the mail-in type voting versus the in-person type voting. So for me, anything that shifts the focus to more in-person voting to me is beneficial from a ballot integrity perspective. So from that standpoint, I'm in agreement. But I noticed that none of these bills put any emphasis on modifying the current practice for absentee voting. Anyway, I'm going to kind of just go through the bill little by little just to give the folks listening an idea of exactly how this process is going to work. And I may have some questions along the way. Section 1 of proposed bill 1057 is what lays out the time frame and period of voting. And it looks like it says it consists of 10 days total, and it says such period of voting shall commence on the 11th day prior and conclude on the 2nd day prior to such regular election or primary. Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure I understand this properly, that sounds like it is going to include the 10 days prior to the election, including Sunday, but will skip Monday. Is that correct?
Through you, Senator Sampson, that is accurate. And the aim behind that provision is to allow the registrars and other elections officials to prepare for Election Day on the Monday before Election Day. Through you.
I'm glad that you said that mouthful and I didn't have to. To prepare for Election Day on Election Day, they had to have Election Day the day before. Worked out. I got it. So no, it makes sense from a logistical point of view, and I completely understand that. I guess the only thing I would say about that provision is that I think it might be somewhat confusing to voters to have them understand that they are going to be able to vote for a significant period leading up to Election Day, but to have to not include Monday as far as early voting goes might be somewhat confusing. And I'm going to kind of get into this conversation at some point in going over the bill about the differences between absentee voting in person and early voting in person, which I don't know that there are many, except that I'll just confirm for the moment that you would still be able to cast an absentee ballot on that Monday. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
Through you, yes.
Thank you very much, sir. Yep. Okay, so, and I... No. Okay. Sorry. So, Section 2 of, or subsection 2 of Section 1 is new in the substitute language. And this is the part that has to do with special elections. And it appears that special elections would be included as well, except they would be limited to a total of 4 days, but the same exact process, if I'm correct. And please stop me if I'm making a mistake and misreading any of this, but it looks like it will be 4 days, including Sunday, skip Monday, and you will, of course, be able to vote on traditional Election Day on Tuesday. I will note that this bill differs from the other two early voting bills in that those other voting bills do include language to include primary elections and referendum. And I'll touch more about it once we get to other parts of this language. But as was pointed out, that's the major distinction between the bills, is the time frame and whether or not budget referendum would be included. Moving down line 19, it says the registrars of each municipality shall designate a location for the conduct of early voting. I noticed a change from the language that we had for the public hearing, basically saying that it would reflect only populations of over 45,000 was the language, and now it's going to change to places with at least 20,000. The municipality may choose to have more than one voting location. Mr. Chairman, maybe you could tell me why the change. Is there something in specific in mind why because I think we're going to capture a lot more towns. I don't know how many towns are over 45,000 versus over 20,000, but I think it's a substantial difference. And I'm just curious if there's a policy reason behind that.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, there is a reason behind that, and it is that we wanted to expand the availability and the flexibility of the system throughout different towns, which have vastly different circumstances, whether it's geographic area that they cover or populations that they cover. But we did not want to make it an unqualified mandate. So the current procedure in this bill would, for municipalities of 20,000, require them to have a public hearing on the subject of having additional early voting locations. And if they ultimately decide not to have additional early voting locations, which they are perfectly allowed to do, they must state why they made that decision. In the converse, if they wish to have an extra early voting location, that location must be applied to the Secretary of the State and approved by the Secretary of the State.
Thank you very much for that information, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to kind of go over that same process, and thank you for sharing that information. So I guess I only have one question about this process, and that is that we are putting this in the hands of the registrars, and each town typically has one from each major party. So you got one Republican registrar and one Democrat registrar, and we're relying on them to determine whether or not there should be an additional location, ultimately to be authorized by the Secretary of State. But I guess my question is, what happens if they don't agree? There's no tiebreaker vote in a particular situation like that. Has that been contemplated?
Yes. What would happen would be that the Secretary of the State would evaluate the situation, and that's an important part of this inquiry. The Secretary of the State would have the opportunity to determine whether such an extra location or additional location were necessary and proper. And I would imagine that if the registrars did not agree that they were capable of having an additional location, or that one was advised, that the Secretary of the State would do a more searching inquiry and be disposed not to grant that additional location.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that answer, although, I don't know that the language of the bill lays that out as clearly as I would like to see it. Maybe it's something we can incorporate in an updated version. Just moving on, subsection 3 says the registrars of voters may delegate to each election or primary official appointed pursuant to subdivision 1. And I went back and I don't find that subdivision 1, so we may have a drafting error that needs to be addressed. I don't know that it's important other than from a technical standpoint, because obviously those officials are appointed. But just reading on, it says they can delegate any of the responsibilities assigned to the registrar of voters. And I'm just curious if that's something we're grabbing from existing law. I understand that obviously registrars are going to be spread pretty thin through this process, but is that something that we do already? Do we allow them to delegate their responsibilities to their assignees? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Through you, there is currently provision for deputy registrars, and we have also allowed, under certain circumstances, town clerks to delegate certain of their duties. And as you indicated, this is a provision meant to allow the registrars to delegate some of their authority and duties to better enable them to cover these early vote locations and also to increase their flexibility. We know that towns across the state have different levels of resources, have different provisions for their registrars, and we wanted to give them that extra flexibility.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to have to take a look at the actual responsibilities of the registrar of voters, which are substantial, just for my own edification, because I think this is a conversation that may reemerge when we debate this bill on the floor of the House or Senate. Just what that means, what we mean by any of the responsibilities that the registrars themselves has. The next few sections look to speak to the process. As was noted, line 82 says the person shall appear in person, which, again, I stress as the one benefit. And the reason why I'm in support of any type of early voting at all is that I think it is advantageous to mail-in voting, which we've been witnessing. Subsection D says that the registrar shall check the statewide centralized voter registration system before allowing electors to vote. I think that's a good provision. The next section, though, it starts talking about if the registrars determine that the elector has not already voted, or if there is no report that the elector has already voted, the registrar shall allow the person to vote. That's obvious. But then the next part says if the registrar determines that the elector has already voted, such elector shall not be allowed to vote, and such matter shall be reviewed by the registrar. After completion of such a review, if a resolution, and that's the key word here, if a resolution of the matter cannot be made, such matter shall be reported to the State Elections Enforcement Commission, which shall conduct an investigation of the matter. I presume this means that if there is some wrongdoing, this will be referred to the SEC for that purpose. But I don't think it says that, Mr. Chairman. It just says if there is no resolution. I mean, we've already determined in lines 97 and 98 that they've determined someone has already voted. It seems to me in a case like that, that automatically should be referred to the State Election Enforcement Commission or some other body, not just after completion of such review if a resolution cannot be made. I'm just wondering if there's anything you might add to my concern on this small subsection 2.
Through you, in answer to your question, the intent of this provision is to ensure that all matters that cannot be quickly resolved or explained be referred to the State Election Enforcement Commission for investigation. Obviously, registrars are not the primary investigative function or agency with regard to our elections. There may be cases where there is some sort of confusion or miscommunication that is quickly resolved based on the facts on the ground, and there's no reason to think that there was wrongdoing. But if that determination cannot be made, we seek to have the opportunity to review and investigate anything about the circumstances that may lead to any allegation of wrongdoing to ensure trust in the system. Through you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the answer. And I'm in complete agreement with what you said. I don't think that matches the words in the bill. And I would just recommend that, as we go forward, that this section is more clear, because I read this to mean that this is applying to only in the case where it is clear that the elector has already voted. They shall not be allowed to vote. And then it shall be reviewed by the registrar. And if there's not a resolution, I don't know what the resolution could be other than to follow through with some sort of penalty or prosecution for someone that is double voting. Certainly, if there's a prosecution or an investigation done by the Secretary of State or State Elections Enforcement Commission, and for whatever reason it is determined not to be a crime, that's a different thing. It seems awful vague to me that it looks like if they can determine that this person double voted, they can certainly prevent someone from voting a second time, but it doesn't say they'll do anything about it. And I think that if we're serious about preventing voter fraud or election abuse of any kind, I think this should be very clear that not only are you going to not be allowed to vote, you're going to be in some type of trouble for attempting to. Just moving on. I guess starting in subsection F, this is where we get into the language that has to do with the process, which I think, based on the testimony of the Secretary of State, is really going to be a temporary process. I think that the hope is down the road, the state of Connecticut is going to purchase new tabulator machines that will have the ability to, calculate votes without, running a tape or disclosing the tally until a point in the future, something like that. I think that this is the problem that was pointed out to me, which is that we're not going to use the tabulators for early voting because once you shut down the machine, it does a tally. And it's very important to make sure that that tally is unknown and therefore secret until the election is completed. So I think what's happening is that this process is being developed in this bill language as a means to work around the lack of appropriate tabulator machines. And that's fine, but I will just point out a couple of things. First off, it says pretty much the same exact process is going to occur as occurs with absentee voting. And one of the things that was mentioned to me by people who worked during the previous elections where we had a great many absentee votes is that the absentee ballots ultimately are folded. And then once they're folded, they are very difficult to unfold and feed through a machine. I'm just wondering if there's any distinction here about what type of envelopes are going to be used, and what are the differences between the absentee ballot envelopes and process. And I'll just give you a little more background, which is that my expectation is that in most towns, they're going to choose their town hall as their early voting polling location. So people will be walking into town hall the same that they would be if they were going to vote by absentee to obtain an application or potentially vote right there in person as absentee, because we can certainly do that. And this process looks virtually identical. Mr. Chairman, am I missing anything in making that assumption and assertion that this is kind of more or less the same process, except obviously without the requirement to complete an application first?
I think you're largely correct, through you, that the process is very similar. The only exception to that I would note is that unlike an absentee ballot, there would be no second outer envelope. There would be only the inner, I guess the equivalent of the inner envelope with the affirmation for an early vote. So there would be one fewer envelopes, but there is no provision for that envelope being of a different sort than the traditional absentee ballot inner envelope. Through you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so I would just point out that it might be worthwhile speaking with the registrars and clerks to have this conversation about the types of ballots and whether or not they will be folded or not. I don't know what the change will be in turnout over the period of early voting, but if it's substantial, it would be certainly helpful to those folks on the ground to be able to feed these ballots through the machine. But if they're folded, I know from listening to their experience that does present a problem. So just something to put on our radar. The lines 127, 128, 129, this is the part where it talks about how at the conclusion of each day, the registrars are going to transport the receptacle containing the early voting ballots to the clerk, and the clerk is going to, it says if necessary, which is my first question, what does that mean? Store in the fire-resistant vault or safe. provided for in Section 7-27 of the general statutes, which my understanding is probably the vault that the town clerk uses for land records, etc. So please confirm that for me. Maybe let me know what "if necessary" means, and then I have a couple of questions about how this relates to ballot integrity.
Thank you. Through you. My understanding of the "if necessary" is that it refers to the necessity of the vault or safe as provided in Section 7-27 of the general statute. So if a fire-resistant vault or safe is required under that provision, then it shall be used and is required, and if not, then it is not. That is my understanding. Through you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what that means effectively is that there could be storage of the early voting ballots in a place that does not meet the requirement for vault or safe provided for in Section 727. That's interesting. I don't know how important it is. I think that's something that we would require some feedback from some local officials to tell us what they would do or what they do in circumstances where they don't have such vault or safe. So that is a question for me. My other questions have to do with who has access to this vault anyway. We're talking about a relatively extensive time frame. Certainly, even in this bill with the 10 days, but even more so if it's 14 days, you're asking the registrars to be on top of this voting process every day for an extended period of time. And then we're going to transfer the responsibility of the watching these early voting ballots to the municipal clerk. I guess what concerns me is how this impacts all of these municipal employees and the hours that they work and when they're supposed to be there and when they're not supposed to be there. And I don't know that that's all been worked out at this point. And I don't know if that's another element of what will ultimately become a cost to towns, and whether such changes are even truly viable. But leave that aside. It's certainly an issue that we should address better. But leave that aside. Who else has access to the land records vault? Seems to me, I'm a realtor. I mean, I've been in the land record vault God knows how many times. Does that mean that that people that are viewing land records and so forth are going to have access to the same room where we are storing our ballots for the purpose of their security?
Through you, Senator, thank you for the question. So with regard to the personnel issues, the procedure should be almost identical and, as a result, pretty smoothly added to the current responsibilities of the town clerk with regard to absentee ballots. And while they would have to be segregated from absentee ballots, the early voting ballots would be stored in the same rough location. They have to be stored under Section F, or subsection F, excuse me, in a secured early voting ballot depository receptacle. So the town clerk would have to maintain the security of that area, obviously, and govern access to the area. But the ballots would also be provided, or it is provided that they would be stored in this secure ballot depository receptacle, which would keep them segregated, not only from the people coming into the room, but also from the absentee ballots. Through you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, no, I appreciate the answer, and it's, pretty much what I expected. I just don't know if that's adequate or secure enough to satisfy, concerns over whether or not the ballots are going to be monitored, whether there's a clear person in charge of their custody at all times. I don't know what happens when the the clerk, is out to lunch, and someone comes in needing to look at the land records. My experience is that the door to the land record vault is usually open during business hours, and people kind of come and go. I think it depends a lot on the town. So just another thing that I think warrants some feedback, and much of the reason why I'm going through the bill in such detail for the benefit of the people listening really is because I'm hopeful that there are people that serve in town government in the capacity as registrar, town clerk, etc., who need to know this information and might react to it in some way where they provide us with some advice and better way of achieving our end goals. The focus obviously being on making sure that we maintain a clear record of custody and that the ballots are secure. The end of that section F is about the counting of the number of ballots, if I'm correct. I was reading through this and I thought that the language was a little hard to follow, but just to confirm, this is only about the recording of the total number of ballots cast during the early voting process on a day-to-day basis. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman? And is it proper that that would be filled out on the head moderator's return in advance of Election Day? I know that now that form's just filled out on Election Day, and I guess that they're going to be hanging on to this form during the entire process and filling it out as time goes on. Is that the way it's envisioned through Mr. Chairman?
Yes, that is my understanding under this language.
Thank you, sir. The next section, Section G, references Title IX, which is the authority that the Secretary of State has. Again, it says, as nearly as possible. It says, regulations adopted under Title IX concerning the procedures related to the custody, control, and counting of absentee ballots shall apply as nearly as possible to the custody, control, and counting of early voting ballots under this section. I guess we're giving some direction to the Secretary of State there that says you should do this like we are telling you in this bill. I think that's somewhat interesting. Section 8 is the 75-foot rule, which is something, we had a little conversation in our caucus about that. Assuming this is not a typical polling location, a school or firehouse or something like that, and it's actually going to be in the town hall, I can just see, some issues with this. Certainly, the point of the 75-foot rule is to keep, candidates and people promoting different candidates, at a distance from the actual voting. I don't know how viable that is in a town hall where you've got people coming and going and interacting with one another. And, I made a joke in our caucus about somebody complaining about their tax bill at the tax desk. Is that, and it happens to be during early voting. Are they going to end up in violation of the 75-foot rule? So just another thing to consider. Again, my goal here is not to just pick out issues with the bill. It's like we should address these items in a way so we don't inadvertently capture activity that we don't mean to, and that if we're going to draft a bill to do early voting, it should be the best bill possible. Section 2 has to do with effectively the expansion of Election Day registration, because now forgive me, I'm just catching up on some of this stuff. Early voting ballots and same-day elections received by the municipal by the other shall be. This is the delivery of the thing. I made a note about the timeline here, and I don't know why, but maybe it'll come back to me at some point. moving forward, I'm in section 3 now, the last section. It says no elector shall be permitted to cast such elector's vote after the hour prescribed unless that person is in line at the prescribed hour. So we've taken our you're in line at 8 p.m. on election day law that was passed in recent years, and now we've added it to this entire period. So I guess that means that on the days where voting ends at 6 p.m., as long as you were in line at 6 p.m., and on the days where it's 8 p.m., as long as you're in line at 8 p.m. I guess my question is, what do we do about the staff involved? Are we going to require that the poll working staff and everybody stays until the last vote is cast as well? It certainly seems that way to me. I won't even pose the question. It's a consideration that I think we need to keep in mind. The next section has to do with the implementation of this policy, and it looks to me from this section, and confirm me, I tried to do all this very quickly earlier, so I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. It looks like this policy of early voting, at least in this bill, the Secretary of State's 1057, that it will not affect the municipal primary in 2023, but it will be in effect for the general election this year. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, and it's the same for all three bills. The purpose behind that is that the municipal primaries this year were judged to be too close to the current time to give officials adequate time to prepare. And we're intending for the first usage of early voting in Connecticut to be in the general election, the municipal elections this year, because the number of voters this year is anticipated to be lower than the number of voters next year, which is the presidential election. And we want to ensure that all the officials involved have an opportunity to run through all of these procedures on a smaller population to essentially work out the kinks so that we can fix any gaps or problems that we recognize next year in anticipation of that presidential election in 2024.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that. One other thing that just occurred to me, just looking at some of these dates on the timeline, and it's coming back to me, that my note that I made in the previous section, which is that I think you're kind of closing up the timeline in some respects, because what we're doing effectively is by moving the beginning of the election process earlier, as much as 14 days, we're closing the window of time between the primary and the general election. And I guess the one thing that concerns me about that really is like CEP candidates. Their ability to raise money after a primary and be able to file and be able to get their funds and still have time to expend those funds to run a campaign. I haven't done the math to figure out the exact number of days in that timeline process, but I think it's worth considering that I think it is going to change pretty dramatically. Just moving on, lines 250 through 252 is the section that effectively says that election day registration now applies throughout the entire early voting process. So effectively you have election day registration. The current law, I believe, says you can register to vote up to 7 days prior to election day, and of course you can register to vote on election day via election day registration. And this changes that so that it will be that entire period, so the 10 days or 14 days prior to election day, but it will also, I think it does move the time frame where the election registration ends normally. And I'll have to get to that section of the bill. Mr. Chairman, can you speak to that quickly, how that changes? If not, I'm going to get to it at some point, so I'll leave it to you.
So I can address the kind of the policy decision why same-day registration was extended to early vote locations and times. We wanted people just like they are currently on election day, to be able to go to the polls, and if they are not already registered, to register and vote in one instance rather than having to come back again and again. And I guess with your more specific question, I'll look forward to when we reach that point in the text.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. I think it's in section 23. I was just looking at it, but I have some more questions on that whole subject matter, so we'll get there. Just going through, I mean, you see all the time changes. There's a lot of conforming language here, just moving up the dates. At some point, I would love to have some kind of chart or graph that kind of lays it out for us on a calendar to get an idea of actually what's happening at what point in the calendar, because there are a lot of dates where candidates are required to file, where the ballots have to be produced, where the last day a candidate can end up on a ballot or can be removed from a ballot. All of these things have to be taken into consideration. And I know that there is an attempt to conform with the election day early period in this language. I feel more comfortable knowing that we looked at it hard enough to know that we got it right, I guess is what I would say. Section 6 and 7 are about public notice. Section 8 is about the certification of ballots. 9, it looks conforming. I was very confused at the end of section 11 about this language about removing candidates, which I know I just mentioned, but I now understand what was doing. But this is an instance of conforming language. And I see that there were 2 separate sections, one to deal with 2023 and then one going forward. Forgive me while I skip through these sections that are conforming to get to something of substance. I noticed section 19, I guess, is the language that starts off talking about the Secretary of State's responsibilities to develop and conduct a statewide public awareness campaign to educate the public regarding the availability of early voting at regular elections and primaries. It also says in subsection B that the Secretary of State shall develop a early voting procedures manual. I don't know if that one manual will suffice or whether or not there needs to be one for the general election for state candidates and one for municipal candidates, because I think there are enough differences in the timelines and so forth that it might make it easier to have 2 separate manuals. This is fine. Obviously, it's going to generate a cost to the state of Connecticut for both of these things. There's some concern about the ability of a sitting Secretary of the State, regardless of who that is, at some point in the future to be able to use this for some type of self-promotion. But I don't see that as a real concern. I think that there should be some timeline in this couple of sections for when the Secretary of State is going to be responsible to produce and provide these things. And I don't see that specified in these sections. Section 20, 21, 22, all conforming. Section 23 is that piece about when the last day to register to vote is. So currently you can register to vote up until 7 days before an election and then on election day via election day registration. And this changes that to 14 days prior to an election. But of course, you'll be able to election day register 11 days before the election because that is the early voting period. So really what we're doing is we're narrowing that down to only 3 days. And I think that the reason why we have the 7 days in our law currently is because what we're trying to do is establish a uniform and clear voter roll of who's registered to vote near to election day that can be relied on universally. And if you've got people registering at the last minute and who's working off what list kind of thing. And I get that. And I'm certainly agree that that's probably necessary. I'm just curious if narrowing that 7 days before one election day to the 3 days prior to 10 election days, or what happens in the other bills, I don't even know. I'd have to go back and look and see what the time frame is. But something obviously that needs to be addressed to make sure that we do leave that proper window. If you have, Mr. Chairman, if you know how it's addressed in the other two bills, I'd appreciate that.
Yes. So to answer your question about the other two bills, these days would just be changed by the numbers of days difference. So it would just be 4 days earlier. Essentially, it'll provide the same period.
Right. So it would be the 18th day prior to election. That makes sense. But we'd be left with the same situation, which is a very narrow amount of time that you could not register, which is probably a good thing. But is it enough time to accommodate the requirement to get one solid voter roll list? Okay. Looks like more changes that are just conforming in 24 and 25. I guess that's really all I had on the bill language itself. Just to bring us back to the beginning of the conversation, and you can see, I mean, I think that the bill's a lot more extensive than I had originally anticipated, and I think that's a good thing. I think that the folks that have been working on this have tried to come up with a appropriate policy for each conceivable question and concern that could come up. But as you can see, I'm just one set of eyes. I think that if other people start to go through this bill the way I did, they might find other things that are worth looking at. So hopefully we can correct them and get this as correct as possible on the first shot, and trying to work out as many kinks as we can before we're even doing that in practice. Just a question that I thought of while we were going through this, which is the notion of the process being very similar to someone coming into the town hall and saying they want to vote early. How does the town clerk make a determination whether or not that person should be early voting or casting an absentee ballot in person?
Thank you. So you have to have one of the 6 reasons for obtaining an absentee ballot that are laid out in our state constitution and also in our state statutes in order to obtain an absentee ballot. However, under early voting, you wouldn't have to give any reason. Ultimately, the process would be pretty similar because you'd be showing up in person and you would be entitled to vote early by early vote in-person ballot, regardless of the circumstance. I don't think that the personnel operating the voting location would have to ask you any questions at all if you indicated you just want to vote. The person could say, do you want to vote here or do you want to vote absentee? And then if they want to vote there, they vote early via early voting in person. And if they, for whatever reason, want to take home an absentee ballot, they would then have to give one of the reasons that are listed by statute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so effectively, I get your response, and it's very thorough, and I agree that it is completely accurate. I mean, as I had pointed out earlier, everyone can answer with the response illness, and therefore, effectively, there is no excuse for absentee voting required. But leave that as it may, does it really? I guess it goes back to my Monday question is really the thing, which is that if you show up on the Monday and you say, I want to early vote, is it the expectation of this policy that's before us that they'll be turned away, told to come back tomorrow, or they'll be offered an absentee ballot? What's likely to happen on that Monday where early voting is not in effect?
Thank you. So my understanding would be that in that situation, the person would have the opportunity to request an absentee ballot. However, they would have to affirm, under penalty of false statement, that one of those reasons prevents them from voting in person. And I guess I take the Senator's point about the capacious nature of the illness reason, but the limiting factor in that reason is the voters' affirmation that illness will prevent them from voting ordinarily on election day. So obviously there are a variety of illnesses, whether it's that person's or someone else's, that could qualify, but the person is limited in that they must affirm that whatever the illness is, it will prevent them from voting in the ordinary in-person fashion on election day.
Thank you very much for that response, Mr. Chairman. And not to turn this into a debate on that subject, I just would say that I wish that many of both of our colleagues during the last election took that view, because they didn't. In fact, there were TV ads galore from very high-ranking candidates, actually, some elected and some not, who made it quite clear that anyone could get an absentee ballot just by asking. And they did that in TV ads, radio ads, mailed correspondence, et cetera, and then went so far as to provide them with ballot applications without any indication that they had any illness related to them whatsoever. And that's the problem that I see with that. So, again, that's not necessarily relevant to this exact topic, but it's all relevant because, you know, my issue with all of this is that in the zeal to expand so many different avenues for voting, I think we've made what is somewhat confusing out of the situation, and it's very duplicative. I mean, an argument can be made that we have early voting right now. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I just made the argument that we already have no excuse absentee voting, and while I appreciate your comments and your distinction between whether someone could be eligible versus them actually stating that they're eligible, the fact of the matter is that we've witnessed how it works in practice, which is the fact that everyone is eligible and they're encouraged to participate in that way by campaigns and candidates. And because that situation exists, you effectively have early voting in person or by mail as early as maybe certainly 30 days before election, but maybe before that. I don't know exactly when they print the absentee ballot applications. So there's that. And then early voting is simply going to be another mechanism where many people will do virtually the same thing. They'll walk into the town hall and ask to vote. I guess the distinction is not really clear for me. And if it's not really clear for me, I can imagine how vague it might be for a voter who has not thoroughly perused our voting laws in the state or been paying close attention as we've made these changes in recent years. And to me, what I would like to see is us, come up with a clear process. For me, we would go back to having the most legitimate version of absentee voting that has existed in the past, which is 5 days, and the illness has to apply to you directly. And we're not going to be as concerned about expanding it because we're already expanding early voting 10 or 14 days. You don't need to go through all that. But that's neither here nor there, and I don't foresee that there's a desire on the part of the majority to go back and limit the absentee voting, and my proof is the fact that we're still looking at a constitutional amendment for something that I believe we have in effect already. So I think that I've covered kind of my concerns about the way we're headed on election law in the state as it is, which is that you'll get no argument from me or any of my Republican colleagues, and I think I can speak for them in this way by saying that we're all very much in favor of expanding access to voting. No one wants to prevent anyone from voting unless they should be prevented by virtue of, criminal activity or ineligibility in some way. In every other aspect, we are on the same page, which is to say we want to encourage people to take an important role in preserving our electoral system and our form of representative government, which is so important to maintaining the system of laws and justice that we have in this country. So the issue really boils down to not access, but it is, are we preserving the integrity of elections in the process? And this is where I always say we fall short, because the fact of the matter is we fall short. I have a number of amendments, Mr. Chairman. I did tell your co-chair that I would wait until she was back on Zoom before I would call those amendments. And so if she is, I will begin. Alternatively, I could let other members of the committee speak to the bill first and maybe offer the amendments at the end. I would give you that option, and you can let me know how you want me to proceed.
I will leave it to you. All right.
I'll come back to the amendments.
Sounds good. Representative Hoxha, you are recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As promised, I have a number of amendments that I'd like to offer on Senate Bill 1057. As we talked about in the start of the conversation about early voting, that the bills are similar. The three early voting bills, the two Senate bills 1057 and 1064, and House Bill 5004. The only distinction being the time frame in 1057 being 10 days of early voting, the other two bills being 14 days, and the inclusion of referendum questions being included in the Senate Bill 1064 and House Bill 5004, but not included in Senate Bill 1057. I could have easily made these amendments on any of the three bills, but since I focused my remarks on Senate Bill 1057, I'm going to offer them on this particular bill, although just to follow up on the conversation that the chair just had with Representative Carpino, I'm certainly sympathetic to that, and I agree. It's unusual to have multiple bills with different policy solutions to the same subject matter. We certainly do have multiple bills that discuss different topics, but this is a pretty cut and dry situation of very, very similar bills with multiple different avenues being presented. Certainly during the public hearing process, I think that was a valuable tool to ascertain what the public thinks about the time frame that is being proposed and weigh in on what they think is a more prudent time frame. I'm disappointed that a time frame that I would have approved of was not among those proposals, and it still is not represented among these bills. Maybe we have a chance to fix that right now by amending one of these bills to a time frame that I see as an attempt to approach this subject in the most comprehensive but also bipartisan manner that is possible. I can tell you that I'm personally not going to vote for any of the three bills on the agenda unless some of these amendments are adopted. But I don't say that in a way to be a nudge, as my grandmother would say. I do that as in my desire to make our final product something that is a policy decision made by the entire GAE committee and hopefully the entire legislature, and not just the majority party, regardless of what the minority party thinks. And I hope it will be taken in that frame. So without further ado, the first amendment that I'm going to offer, and I can pass these down, although I understand the clerk is going to share them by email also. These do not, they do have there's no LCO or anything for this language, but this amendment would effectively change the time frame on this bill from a 10-day period for early voting to 3 days within a period of 5 days, ultimately allowing the choice of Friday, Monday, Tuesday, or Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, or Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. I don't know if I need to pass these out to the members of the committee. If there's anyone who wants a hard copy, I can. One thing I would say about this amendment, which I will go into, I'll explain it a little more thoroughly, and I'll move its adoption and so forth. But just in my argument for the amendment is simply that it will certainly help its passage. I would be very inclined to support this legislation going forward as part of the team putting together our early voting law for Connecticut if it were to be adopted. It will significantly shorten debate going forward in the Senate. I can promise you that. And I think it has a lot of other benefits other than, Sampson is for it. I think there's other things that should be taken into consideration. We've talked about the cost factor. I know that it's been presented that we're going to start with a 10 or 14-day period. We're going to try and do it this year in the municipal election to get the kinks out so that we can work forward. I firmly believe that we are far better off offering a shorter time frame to start with, not to put so much burden on the municipal officials that are going to be responsible for carrying out this activity. I would much rather see them have a workable time frame. The constitutional amendment has already been adopted, and now it's just a matter of legislation being passed to change this going forward to make alterations in how the policy works. If it's determined that it goes smoothly 3 and 5 days and there is a benefit that members of the legislature see in expanding that time frame, they have the ability to do so with a simple majority. It's a much lower hurdle, and I don't think it's an unreasonable ask from that perspective. So without further ado, the amendment, I don't know if I would need to read the whole thing, but I will since it's one paragraph. It says, Section 1 new, this would be effective July 1st, 2023. Any eligible elector may vote prior to the date of regular election or primary in accordance with the provisions of this section during a period of early voting at each such regular election held on or after July 1st, 2023, and at each primary held on or after January 1st, 2024, the same as the underlying bill. Such period of early voting shall, A, notwithstanding the provisions of Section 9-2 of the General Statutes, commence on the 6th day prior to and conclude on the 2nd day prior to such regular election or primary, and consist of 3 total days to be determined by the Secretary of State, such times as provided in subsection C of Section 9-174 of the General Statutes as amended by this Act. And I move adoption, and I'd like a roll call vote. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to comment briefly on this amendment also. I couldn't agree more with my fellow ranking member. If there's one thing that I think that we could do that's relatively simple and easy to employ in our election policy in the state of Connecticut that would restore confidence in many, many people who have a lack of confidence in the integrity of our elections in Connecticut, this is definitely it. As she mentioned, people often say that Connecticut has, some of the tightest elections that there are, and they're almost always exclusively talking about the access to the election process, because up until recently we did not have no excuse absentee voting. I know I say that tongue-in-cheek. And we're now discussing early voting. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to our security-based policy when it comes to elections, we are lagging way behind the rest of the country. It was extremely eye-opening. I mentioned earlier today that we had a brief discussion with the Secretary of State from the state of Georgia, who has all of these policies. They have no excuse absentee voting, and they have early voting. I don't know the period of time, but they have pretty much everything that is being discussed and proposed in Connecticut. But they have also simultaneously really employed as much security in their process as possible. They require photo ID for every voter, and that means not just in-person voting. They have photo ID for absentee voting, and they also have other mechanisms to identify the signer of a document when the ballot application is produced, and they're way ahead of us in making sure that the security and integrity of elections are maintained. And as I mentioned early on, to me, these issues are nothing more than items that ought to be approached in a bipartisan nature, because these are the rules of the game. This is not something that we're debating about social policy. This is, can we please agree on how we're going to do elections so that we afford opportunity and also make people on the street confident that what we're doing means a legitimate result. And to me, photo ID is something that I'm extremely passionate about. If you talk to voters, it is overwhelmingly popular. I have seen polls on photo ID as high as 90% of voters. I've also seen the man on the street interview with people from inner city neighborhoods, the same people that are always used as the reason for why this is a terrible and racist policy that suppresses the vote. It's not. They don't think so. They recognize that obtaining an ID is not such a chore and such a difficult thing to achieve. The fact of the matter is, if I went through a list of all the things that you need to have a driver's license for to pursue in the world we live in, it would shock you. Everything from getting on an airplane to cashing a check to buying liquor. I mean, you could like go through a laundry list of items that you need photo ID for. And yet the state of Connecticut does not require photo ID for voting. It boggles the mind. This will be, I don't know how many times I've offered this amendment in this committee and on the floor of both the House and Senate. I have the privilege of doing both. And it has failed every time on a party line vote. And I'm going to do it again today with another try. Please consider the fact that photo ID is not just something that will actually benefit the quality and integrity of our elections. It will go a long way to letting me and my colleagues in the minority believe that we're in this together to make this policy for early voting something that the legislature believes in. After all, we all represent the same number of people back home, and each one of us is here representing them and their voice. And it's very frustrating when something as what I consider to be a pretty minor ask on a major, major policy decision that the state of Connecticut is making to implement early voting, that we keep in mind that photo ID is something that the minority sees as critically important, and so do a majority of your own constituents. So I'm proud to second this motion for that amendment, and I hope that folks across the spectrum see the value in it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to address the concerns that have been mentioned. The first thing I would suggest is that this amendment, while it would require everyone to have a photo identification to cast a ballot, the part that seems to be concerning the members of the minority is the cost associated with providing these IDs to a very limited number of people in this state. I don't know anyone personally that does not have an ID, and that includes people that are have disabilities and do not drive. The fact of the matter is that to actively participate in American society in 2023, you've got to have a photo ID. There are very, very few people who don't. So forgive me for suggesting, through you, Mr. Chairman, that is a very disingenuous argument, especially when this legislature has been spending billions of dollars each year to grow our government programs and assistance. When I was first elected, there were less than 200,000 people on Medicaid. Now it is 1 million people in our state. I mean, that's a third of the state population receives Medicaid benefits. I don't know how much a photo ID is going to actually cost to produce and deliver to someone via the mail or to be picked up in person. I mean, it's a negligible cost, and we're associating this cost only with people that cannot afford to purchase one on their own. The number of people this is going to apply to probably amounts to in the, sub 5,000 number for the entire state of Connecticut. We're talking about a tremendously small appropriation. There's our bills in this legislature to spend $2 million to invite people to have abortions from out of state in Connecticut. We're talking about Medicaid for illegal aliens. To have a conversation and to have a policy decision like this being put in question over a tremendously small number of people and a tremendously small amount of money that it would cost to provide them with the access necessary, to me is just absurd. And I would add to that just because it is a right does not necessarily mean that other people's rights cannot be affected by someone's failure to be able to provide their identity. The purpose of this legislation is to protect the validity and integrity of the entire vote, which means to protect the rights of every person voting, not just the person in question who's being required to have a photo ID. The fact of the matter is there is a huge population of people in the state who want more protections so that they can be confident that the election is accurate and only legitimate voters participated. And this is a mechanism to get there to protect their right. I'd also add that there are many rights that people have in this country that we do charge them fees for. And I might agree with the good senator on the subject that we shouldn't be, like gun permits, for example. The right to possess and firearms is in our state and U.S. Constitution, and yet the state of Connecticut feels it's necessary to charge someone for a permit to do so. So unless we're going to repeal that, I don't think it's appropriate to be putting into question the small amount of fee associated with providing other people with these IDs. I was going to address the issue with the big lie. I just want to point out that no one on this committee has ever made representations about the 2020 presidential election being in doubt or in question. Not a single time. In fact, myself, and I don't want to speak for anyone else on this regard, but I have taken a lot of heat from Republicans across this state and, in fact, across the country, because I have done my due diligence to make sure that when I discuss voter fraud and election integrity issues, I only speak to things that I can actually identify. I don't talk about perceptions or hyperbole or assumptions or accusations. I only bring up factual evidence, and I've done it many times in this committee and on the floor of the Senate. So if that counts as a viable explanation with regard to the 2020 election, I would hope it would. Again, I don't mean to go on and on about this issue other than to say that this is a very small ask. It's a legitimate one. And again, it's not even coming from me or from my colleagues on the Republican side of this committee. It's coming from your voters back in home. 90% of people in Connecticut want photo ID for voting. An overwhelming number of our constituents. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I have another amendment I'd like to offer on Senate Bill 1057. This one addresses some of the concerns that I brought up when I was going line by line through the bill itself. One thing that we are doing in the process of expanding the time frame for voting to include early voting, 10 days, 14 days, what have you, is we are also expanding the provision for Election Day registration. And one of the concerns that I've had since we enacted Election Day registration years ago was the fact that there's no follow-up in the state of Connecticut. Just another instance where other states that have similar, very open access policies also bother to do the other half of the equation, and that is include the protection that goes with that access. We don't have any protections associated with Election Day registration. In fact, we do not even keep track of the number of people that use Election Day registration. We do not keep track of the number of people that, once they are registered by the town and the verification is mailed to them, how many people receive that verification, how many of those are returned, which should pose a very serious question to anyone about how someone was able to indicate an identity and an address to vote on Election Day, but then shortly thereafter, their mail is returned using that same information. We keep no information and no record keeping and no audits of that information. And to me, that's a failure. If you're going to institute a policy like election day registration, you should be tracking it to make sure that it's beneficial. And I'll repeat something I just said, which is that everything that we do to increase the access to elections has to be coupled with the idea that it's our job also to make sure that we are not tampering with the accuracy of that election, because everyone who votes, their rights are at stake. Because if we're allowing votes to be counted that are not legitimate, then what is the value of other individuals' votes? To me, that's the way I've always looked at this, and that's the reason why I think that many of these policies, photo ID, audits on election day registration, I think are valuable, and they restore trust where trust is lacking. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a rather lengthy amendment, but I do believe it's been distributed by the clerk, and I can just briefly describe it to say that this would create an audit system for early voting. Effectively, what it does is it requires the registrars back in each of our towns to track the number of election day voters there are, election day registered voters, rather, and how many are subsequently placed on the inactive registry as a result of the notice being returned, undelivered, etc. And it would also require that reporting to go to the Secretary of State, and that Secretary of State would compile those reports and send them back to us so that we would have this information for policy-making purposes. I move adoption. I think this is a smart amendment. I don't see how anyone could object to knowing whether our policy system is actually working. And I'd like a roll call vote. Thank you. Mr. Chairman. Yeah, disappointed that that amendment also failed. I said jokingly back here that we're dispelling the myth that we're working on this legislation in a bipartisan way anyway. And I'm sad that that seems to be more truth than just humor. And for people at home, I mean, we do work together on a great number of things. It just, I'm disappointed that this isn't one of them. And I completely understand the passion that comes from people on both sides of the aisle. I know that during our amendment conversation, things got a little feisty, but that's good. And I certainly respect my colleagues who have different views. As long as people come to the table with honesty and passion, and I certainly respect a difference of opinion. I do have a number of other amendments before me, but I'm not going to call them today. I think there's not a lot of purpose today to continue to do that. My goal was really to provide a little preview to some of the things that I think are important if there was a desire to engage the minority in a fruitful conversation to come up with a bill that we can truly say is something developed by the Connecticut legislature, inclusive of Democrats and Republicans. And I'm going to remain hopeful that that happens. I've got great confidence in both the chairs of this committee that they're good people, and they see my perspective on some occasions anyway. I wish it was on more occasions. And I will reiterate that, you know, if we could just adopt a couple of these provisions, it might go a very long way to getting us to some bipartisan agreement. I think narrowing the time frame of early voting and incorporating at least some of the protections that we've discussed here today could turn this into a unanimous vote down the road. And I'd much prefer to see that, Mr. Chairman. But with that, I will relinquish the microphone.